Hello, hi. My name is Earl Thomas, retired historian, artist, and painter. Today we will be exploring the so-called infamous world of medieval jesters. Ease into your most comfortable attire, dim the lights, and enjoy history. The clown, the trickster. But let me start by warning you. What we think of when we hear the word jester is not quite the full reality. Pop culture has both preserved and distorted their image. And so our task as historians is to peel away the layers of myth and stereotype in order to understand who these people really were, why they mattered, and what they reveal about medieval society. This will not be a dry march through dates and names. Rather, I'd like you to imagine yourselves in a medieval hall. The torches are burning. Courtiers line the walls. At the center sits a king or queen, tense perhaps with political burdens. And then in rushes the fool, chattering nonsense, mocking, juggling, singing a tune, or perhaps even speaking blunt truth no one else dares utter. In that moment, laughter breaks the solemn atmosphere. But behind the laughter, there is also a strange kind of wisdom. But before we travel back in time, let's address some of the misconceptions that often surround medieval jesters. The caricature of the clown. Many people assume jesters were simply clowns doing silly tricks. While comedy was essential, their role extended far beyond slapstick. They were storytellers, satirists, musicians, and in some cases, close companions to kings and nobles. The assumption they were all disabled. You may hear that all jesters were people with physical or mental differences, exploited for the amusement of others. In reality, medieval sources make a distinction. Some fools, called natural fools, did indeed have cognitive or physical differences. But the majority were artificial fools, trained performers, witty and sharp-tongued. The idea that they were powerless, quite the opposite. In certain contexts, jesters wielded a unique kind of freedom. They could speak truths that would cost other courtiers their heads. Their mockery could relieve political tension or even shape the decisions of a ruler. So when we talk about jesters, we're talking about a complex social role that defies the simple image of comic relief missions. To understand the medieval jester, we must begin long before the Middle Ages. Entertainment, and in particular, comic entertainment, has been part of human culture as far back as we can trace. Records suggest that dwarfs and performers held special roles in Egyptian courts. Some were entertainers, others were believed to have spiritual significance. Humor and spectacle accompanied royal life even here. The Romans had their own forms of comic performers, clowns, mimes, and buffoons, who lampooned daily life. The Latin word follis, meaning bag of wind or fool, is one of the linguistic roots of our modern concept of the fool. Roman theaters often featured low comedy characters who made fun of the powerful, albeit within certain limits. Across the world, in imperial China, there are stories of jesters like Yu Sei, a court fool who used humor to dissuade Emperor Qin Shi Huang from impractical projects. This shows us that the idea of the licensed fool who could critique the ruler is not uniquely European. In Northern Europe, poets and entertainers blended satire with performance. The skalds of Scandinavia often used wit to lampoon rivals, while Celtic bards sometimes mocked kings in verse. The medieval jester did not emerge out of thin air. He is part of a long lineage of performers who occupied that ambiguous role, both inside and outside of power, both loved and mocked, both tolerated and feared. Now let's step into the early Middle Ages, a world shaped by castles, monasteries, and feudal courts. Where do we first see fools? We find scattered mentions in chronicles. The early medieval courts of the Frankish and Carolingian kings occasionally mention entertainers who combined music, physical comedy, and satire. One important development is the Christian framing of foolishness. Medieval Christianity often contrasted the foolishness of the world with the wisdom of God. In this light, fools took on a symbolic role. Nonsense could reveal truth. Some saints even adopted the guise of holy fools, especially in Byzantine tradition, where acting insane was seen as a form of humility and critique of worldly pride. By the 11th and 12th centuries, the term fool in European courts was becoming more defined. These were not yet the brightly dressed jesters of later centuries, but they were already figures who combined comic performance with the license to mock. Here we come to a distinction you'll want to remember, because medieval sources often use it. Natural fools were people who, due to mental or developmental differences, were seen as lacking full reason. Nobles sometimes kept them as companions, not only for entertainment, but also as objects of fascination or even pity. This practice may seem troubling to us today, but in the medieval worldview, the natural fool could embody innocence, simplicity, and even a strange form of divine wisdom. Artificial fools, they trained in music, mimicry, satire, juggling, acrobatics. They chose the role, learned the craft, and were valued for their wit and performance. These are the jesters we most often think of when we imagine a medieval court. Quick tone, clever, and deliberately comic. And interestingly, both kinds could coexist in the same court. A king might have a natural fool for companionship and an artificial fool for entertainment. The boundary between the two was not always clear, and chroniclers often blurred them together. Why did medieval courts even need fools? Why did monarchs, who commanded armies, who held the lives of their subjects in their hands, choose to surround themselves with jesters? The answer lies in the atmosphere of the medieval court. Imagine the pressure of ruling, the rigid etiquette, the constant jockeying of courtiers for power and favor. In such a tense environment, laughter was a release. A fool could break the stiffness of ceremony. But there's more. Jesters could also say what others dared not. By cloaking their words in humor, they could point out hypocrisy, challenge a decision, or simply provide an honest reflection of reality. The jester's nonsense often carried sense. As one chronicler of the time put it, the fool says in jest what the wise man thinks, but fears to say. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the jester was a recognizable figure across Europe. Courts, noble households, even bishops sometimes employed fools. They were part of a larger world of entertainment that included minstrels, jongleurs, and troubadours, but fools were distinct because of their license to mock. They developed their own costumes, their own props, their own verbal style. And as the Middle Ages moved toward the Renaissance, jesters would become increasingly central to court culture, some rising to near celebrity status. When you picture a medieval court, perhaps you imagine a great hall filled with stone pillars, banners fluttering, nobles whispering, servants scurrying about, and at the center of it all, a king or queen. The atmosphere is tense, ceremonial, almost suffocating. Into this world enters the jester. jingling his bells, grinning mischievously, and daring to break the solemn silence with laughter. This is the paradox we must understand. The jester lived in a world of rigid hierarchy, yet was granted an unusual freedom to cut through it. Let us see what this meant in practice. A court jester's day was not simply one long performance. He was often a companion to the ruler, someone who might be summoned in the morning to lighten the mood, who might sit at meals to keep conversation lively, who might be called in at night to sing or tell stories. A jester was in many ways part of the fabric of courtly life. They entertained in multiple forms. Sometimes this meant comic skits or acrobatics, sometimes songs and music, sometimes sharp verbal exchanges. A skilled jester could juggle, play instruments, improvise rhymes, and mimic the accents or behavior of courtiers. They were masters of variety, adapting to what the moment required. But beyond mere entertainment, jesters often had an intimate relationship with their master. Some rulers treated them almost like pets, but many others trusted them as confidants. It is no exaggeration to say that a clever fool could hold more influence over a king than high-ranking nobles who were bound by etiquette and fear. Consider the example of Will Somers, perhaps the most famous English jester. He served Henry VIII and remained in the royal household through the reigns of Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth II. Somers was beloved for his honesty. Chroniclers tell us that he could make Henry laugh during moments of terrible anger, an ability few others possessed. Some accounts even suggest that he used humor to temper the king's rages or soften his harsh decisions. That is no small feat in the court of a man known for executing wives and ministers. In France, we find the case of Triboulet, jester to King Francis I. Triboulet was known for his sharp tongue, and one famous story tells of him insulting a noble. The king, half amused and half concerned, told him he would be executed unless he could think of a clever excuse. Triboulet replied that if he must die, he wished to choose the manner of his death. Francis granted him this unusual privilege. Triboulet then declared, "I wish to die of old age." The king, delighted by the wit, spared life. Such tales illustrate both the danger and the power of jesters. They walked a razor's edge, saved only by quick thinking. What made the jester stand out from other courtiers was his license. He was permitted to mock, to criticize, even to insult. Where a nobleman risked disgrace or execution by offending the monarch, the jester was shielded by his role. Yet this freedom was never absolute. Jesters lived by their wits, and a failed jest could be fatal. While many kings were tolerant of their fools, others could be unpredictable. It was a delicate dance, to push boundaries without overstepping them. This explains why many professional fools were remarkably intelligent. They had to read the mood of the court, judge the temperament of their master, and craft their humor accordingly. Their privileges extended beyond words. Jesters often wore distinctive costumes, the motley of bright, clashing colors, the hood with donkey ears or coxcomb, and the jingling bells. They carried a mock scepter called a bauble, often topped with a carved head or doll that represented themselves. These symbols marked them as both inside and outside the social order. In some cases, they even dined at the king's table, an extraordinary honor in a world obsessed with hierarchy. Yet, for all these privileges, their lives could be precarious. They were dependent on the favor of their master. If dismissed, they had little to fall back on. A new monarch might decide not to keep the fool. Illness or age could end a career abruptly. Despite their apparent freedom, they were often as vulnerable as any servant. Now, it would be a mistake to think jesters only lived in royal palaces. The tradition extended into towns, markets, and noble households across Europe. Noble households across Europe. There were village fools, traveling fools. In many cities, public festivals featured fools who parodied authority. Think of the Feast of Fools, where lower clergy dressed up as bishops and performed absurd rituals. Think of carnival processions, with mock kings and costume jesters leading the crowd. These events inverted the normal order of society for a day, allowing laughter to provide release before normal life resumed. Jesters fit naturally into this world of festive inversion. At fairs, fools might perform alongside jugglers, minstrels, and animal trainers. They were not always attached to a single patron, but earned their living through performance fees or by passing the hat. Some became semi-professional wanderers, recognizable figures who circulated between courts, fairs, and festivals. This reminds us that the jester was part of a much broader culture of performance in the Middle Ages. Alongside him were the troubadours who sang love poetry, the jongleurs who juggled and played music, and the minstrels who told stories. But the jester was distinctive in his license to mock and in his iconic appearance. He was not simply a performer, but a symbolic figure, the embodiment of folly and truth. The jester's role was not uniform across Europe. Each region shaped him differently. In England, fools became particularly associated with the monarchy. Records of fools appear regularly in royal accounts, and some, like Wilsamers, became legendary. In France, fools often combined physical comedy with biting satire. Crackle is the standout figure, but there were many others attached to noble courts. In Italy, jester tradition blended with the rise of professional theater. By the Renaissance, Italian courts saw fools giving way to the characters of commedia dell'arte, like Arlecchino, who inherited many jester-like traits. In Spain, fools often mixed performance with music and were sometimes dwarfs or people with distinctive appearances, kept as curiosities as well as entertainers. In Eastern Europe, the jester role endured longer, with fools still common in some courts well into the 17th century. Russian courts even maintained them in parallel with the Orthodox tradition of holy foolishness. These variations remind us that jester is not a single uniform role, but a flexible tradition that adapted to local culture. Let us pause here and reflect. What function did the jester serve, not just for the ruler, but for society as a whole? On one level, he was simply comic relief. Life in the Middle Ages was harsh, rigid, often grim. Laughter was a necessary release, and jesters provided it. On another level, jesters embodied the medieval fascination with reversal. The fool could mock the wise. The lowly could speak to the high. The world could be turned upside down. In festivals, in plays, and in court, fools reminded people that life is unstable, that the order of the world is not absolute. This was not just entertainment, but also a kind of social safety valve. And finally, the jester often spoke truths that others could not. Wrapped in humor, his words could reveal hypocrisy, injustice, or folly in those around him. In this way, he functioned as a mirror. When we think of medieval jesters, it is easy to imagine a generic figure in motley, jingling bells, performing tricks for a king. Yet history gives us vivid examples of real individuals who walked the delicate line between entertainment and influence. Some became famous not just for their humor, but for the ways they shaped court life, influenced rulers, or left lasting cultural marks. Today, we will explore a few of the most notable jesters from European history and reflect on what they helped achieve. Perhaps the most famous English jester, Will Somers, served Henry VIII and later other monarchs in the 16th century. Unlike many of his contemporaries, we know a relatively great deal about him thanks to detailed records and chroniclers of the Tudor court. Somers was renowned for his intelligence, quick wit, and ability to speak frankly to the king. What did he achieve? Somers had a rare combination of trust and freedom. While courtiers feared Henry's temper, Somers could make light of sensitive topics, sometimes correcting the king with humor where others could not. Chroniclers suggest he helped soften Henry's moods and possibly influence the king's social interactions, smoothing tense situations at court. Somers' role illustrates the broader social function of jesters. They were more than entertainers, they acted as emotional regulators and even subtle advisors. His fame endured beyond his lifetime, cementing the jester's archetype in English culture. Next is Triboulet, a jester to King Louis XII, and later Francis I of France, was known for his sharp tongue and daring humor. He is remembered particularly for his audacity in confronting powerful figures. One famous anecdote describes how he insulted a nobleman so boldly that the king threatened him with execution. Triboulet's clever reply: "I wish to die of old age," won the king's favor and preserved his life. Triboulet's achievements were subtle but important. He exemplified the jester's ability to speak truths under the guise of comedy. By daring to satirize the powerful, he exposed hypocrisy and highlighted issues that courtiers might otherwise ignore. In this sense, he served as both a mirror and a check on authority, demonstrating how humor could be a tool of social insight. Moving to Eastern Europe, we encounter Stacek, the court jester of the Polish kings Sigismund I and Sigismund II in the early 16th century. Unlike many jesters remembered primarily for their antics, Stacek was deeply political. He commented on the events of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, criticizing poor decisions by rulers and nobles, often through clever allegory and satire. Stacek's achievements lie in his role as a political commentator. His wit was a vehicle for critique, allowing him to address issues of governance without directly offending the monarch. Later, Polish writers and historians celebrated Stacek as a figure of wisdom, and he became an enduring symbol of the intellectual potential of the jester. In art and literature, he is portrayed as a thoughtful figure, reminding us that a fool could carry moral and political insight as well as entertainment. Followed by Richard Tarleton, active in the late 16th century, was a jester who transitioned from court performance to the public stage. He became one of the most famous actors of Elizabethan England and helped shape the role of the clown in theater. Tarleton is credited with developing improvisational skills that influenced early English comedy, including the works of Shakespeare. Tarleton's achievements highlight the cultural transmission of jester traditions into professional theater. He showed how the techniques of the court jester wordplay, physical humor, and audience engagement could reach a wider public. In doing so, he helped establish a form of entertainment that would survive long after the traditional court jester disappeared. Another notable French jester, Roland Lafall, served the courts of the 15th century. Though less famous than Triboulet, he was known for combining acrobatics, music, and storytelling. His performances often included subtle commentary on court politics, wrapped in humor. Roland Lafall demonstrates that jesters were multifaceted performers. Their influence came not only from direct speech, but also through the way they framed stories, exaggerated events, and highlighted absurdities in everyday life. When we speak of medieval and Renaissance jesters, the conversation almost always centers on men. Figures like Will Somers, Triboulet, and Stacek dominate the narrative. Yet history also preserves traces of women who took on the role of fool or jester. These women navigated a world of rigid social norms while performing a role that allowed unusual freedoms. Their stories, though less documented, reveal much about gender, power, and performance in historical Europe. The term female fool was sometimes applied to women in noble households or public festivals who performed comedic or satirical acts. Unlike their male counterparts, female fools often faced a double bind. They were expected to entertain through wit and physical comedy, yet society judged them more harshly for transgressing gender norms. A woman who mocked a lord or spoke irreverently could be seen as dangerously inappropriate, while a male jester doing the same was tolerated, even celebrated. Despite these challenges, female fools carved out a space for themselves. They were performers, companions, and occasional social commentators. In some cases, they were trained professionals. In others, they were natural fools whose presence in a household or court offered both amusement and a lens through which serious matters could be examined. Much like male jesters, female fools often served as companions to members of the nobility. They attended to the daily lives of queens, princesses, and noblewomen, providing entertainment, relief from monotony, and sometimes subtle counsel. In these private contexts, they were allowed freedoms that other women might not have enjoyed. For example, a female fool might tell stories or sing songs that gently mocked the behavior of the household, or comment on the social dynamics of servants and guests. In doing so, she occupied a unique social position, neither entirely servant nor fully equal, but with a voice that could challenge norms in safe and socially acceptable ways. The historical record contains occasional references to women who fulfilled these roles. In France, records of the 16th century mention female performers at courts, often described as fools or jongleurs. And in England, some accounts hint at women entertaining in the households of nobles, though they were less formally recognized than male court jester. These women played an essential role in sustaining courtly culture and enriching the daily lives of the elite. Outside the courts, women also performed as fools in public spaces. Festivals, fairs, and carnivals offered opportunities for inversion, play, and satire, and women could participate in these performances. In these contexts, a female fool could mock authority, comment on social norms, or highlight absurdities in everyday life. For example, during the Feast of Fools or carnival celebrations, women might take on comedic roles, wearing exaggerated costumes, masks, or wigs, performing dances, songs, or skits that inverted societal expectations. Unlike the male jesters, who could sometimes speak directly to kings, female fools often reached their audiences indirectly, performing for the general public or within the confines of courtly households. Nevertheless, their performances could carry sharp social commentary, using humor to explore themes of gender, power, and behavior. Notable examples: Jane the Fool, mentioned in 16th century English records, served in noble households and reportedly entertained guests with witty songs and clever wordplay. Accounts suggest she enjoyed a degree of freedom to speak her mind, albeit in a way framed as entertainment. Mademoiselle Riche, associated with French court entertainment in the late Renaissance, combined acrobatics, singing, and comic performance. She participated in both private court performances and public spectacles, showing the versatility of female fools. In Italy, women in traveling Commedia dell'arte troupes occasionally assumed clown-like roles, performing physical comedy and improvisation. While not always explicitly labeled jesters, these performers inherited many of the skills and social functions of the medieval female fool. These examples show that women, though less visible in records, contributed meaningfully to the culture of performance and humor. They adapted the jester's role to navigate gendered limitations while still participating in social critique and entertainment. Female fools challenged traditional ideas of gender in subtle ways. By performing humor, parody, or satire, they occupied a space usually reserved for men. They could speak truth that others might not dare, mocking behavior, revealing absurdities, and sometimes highlighting injustices within the household or broader society. In addition, female fools contributed to the evolution of theater and performance. Their improvisational skills, musical ability, and comedic timing influenced the development of acting and clowning, particularly in the Renaissance, where performance became increasingly professionalized. Women's participation in these spaces helped normalize female performers and broaden the cultural landscape of humor. Although few female fools have become household names, their influence is felt in later entertainment traditions. In modern circus, theater, and comedy, women routinely take on roles that parallel those of the historical fool. Improvisational comedy, sketch performance, and satirical commentary all owe something to the female performers who first navigated the jester's precarious space. Moreover, the very existence of female fools suggests that the medieval and early modern imagination recognized the subversive potential of women in humor. While male jesters could openly confront kings, female fools often approached critique indirectly, highlighting the ways humor can operate in multiple registers. Their performances were a negotiation, entertaining, social, and at times politically or morally insightful. When we study medieval jesters, we often focus on their relationship with the monarch or nobility, but to fully understand their social role, we must also examine how others in the castle and local community viewed them. The jester was a figure who moved fluidly between hierarchy and marginality, admired and mocked, feared and tolerated, all at once. Their presence shaped interactions far beyond the throne room, influencing the dynamics of court life and the broader town culture. Within the castle, the jester occupied a unique social position. He was not a noble, not a soldier, not a servant in the conventional sense. Yet he interacted daily with all these groups. Castle staff, including cooks, chambermaids, stewards, and guards, often found themselves amused, startled, or even irritated by the fool's antics. Many servants appreciated the jester as a source of entertainment. Medieval castle life could be monotonous and grueling. Kitchens and hallways were filled with labor, tension, and hierarchy. The jester brought levity, offering moments of distraction and laughter. Servants sometimes played roles in his skits, became subjects of his mockery, or were listed as unwitting participants in prank. This interaction allowed them to experience a rare moment of agency, to laugh at their own environment, and to enjoy a temporary inversion of authority. Yet, this relationship could be ambivalent. The jester's freedom to mock extended to everyone, including servants. A poorly judged joke might offend, and a skilled fool had to navigate these interactions carefully. Servants sometimes feared the jester's mockery as much as they admired his wit. This dynamic reflects the broader paradox of the fool, simultaneously entertaining and threatening, familiar yet unpredictable. In some accounts, servants acted as collaborators or assistants in the jester's performances. For example, they might provide props, help stage physical tricks, or cue entrances and exits during skits. This collaborative aspect of humor reinforced social cohesion within the household, creating shared experiences of amusement, while also subtly reinforcing the social order. The jester had freedom that servants did not, but he remained ultimately under the monarch's authority. The courtiers, who were closer to power, had more complex relationships with the jester. They often viewed him as a disruptive but necessary presence. A sharp-witted fool could unsettle pompous courtiers, highlight incompetence, or expose vanity. While this could provoke resentment, it also served as a social check. The jester's humor reminded courtiers that their status, though elevated, was not immune to ridicule. In this sense, the jester functioned as a balancing figure within the court hierarchy. By mocking nobles, he indirectly reinforced loyalty to the monarch. Courtiers understood that the fool's license to jest was a tool wielded by the king or queen. Insulting the jester was tantamount to challenging royal authority. This created a delicate tension. Courtiers might privately grumble, but publicly they had to tolerate or even participate in the fool's antics. Some records suggest that courtiers sometimes tried to manipulate jesters to their own advantage, using flattery or gifts to encourage favorable jests that could influence the monarch's mood or opinion. The jester thus occupied a space in court politics. Not a policymaker, certainly, but a participant in the subtler forms of influence and persuasion that shaped everyday life at court. Beyond the castle walls, the jester's reputation reached the surrounding town and countryside. While most performance was for the court, jesters occasionally ventured into town for festivals, fairs, or special celebration. Here, townsfolk often viewed them with a mixture of amusement, awe, and suspicion. Common people generally admired jesters for their wit and skill. In an era of strict social hierarchy, the fool represented something unusual, a figure who could speak truth under the guise of comedy, who could mock authority without immediate punishment. For townspeople, this was both entertaining and symbolic, suggesting a world in which even the mighty could be laughed at, if only temporarily. At festivals, the jester was part of a broader culture of inversion. Carnival, feast days, and public spectacles provided moments when normal social rules were suspended. Jesters would perform acrobatics, tell jokes, and parody local elite. For ordinary townsfolk, these events were moments of collective laughter, a temporary leveling of social hierarchies. The jester's performance was a public service of sorts. However, there were also ambivalent feelings. Some viewed jesters as outsiders or troublemakers, people whose humor could be too sharp or whose presence disrupted daily life. In tight-knit communities, humor at the expense of others could be perceived as dangerous or subversive. Stories in local chronicles sometimes hint at resentment toward traveling fools who mocked local authorities or provoked dispute. The jester's role was precarious, admired and feared, integrated yet marginal, entertaining yet potentially threatening. From servants to courtiers to townsfolk, the jester was often seen as a mirror of society. He reflected the absurdities, vanities, and contradictions of everyday life. Castle workers might see their own frustrations and desires caricatured. Courtiers saw their pretensions exposed. Townsfolk saw the vulnerabilities of those in power laid bare. This function of reflection and critique is essential to understanding the jester's broader social impact. Laughter became a form of social commentary, a subtle corrective that reminded all participants of human folly. In many ways, the jester was an early form of public opinion. He expressed truths that could not be articulated openly, and in doing so, helped communities negotiate social hierarchies, tensions, and expectations. One striking feature of the jester's social reception is how he bridged class boundaries. He could interact with monarchs and servants, nobles and townsfolk in ways few others could. His humor allowed a temporary suspension of rigid social rules, creating shared experiences of amusement. In this sense, the jester functioned as a social lubricant, easing tension and facilitating cohesion. Yet this bridging was always delicate. While he could temporarily invert hierarchies through humor, he remained ultimately subordinate. A misjudged joke could alienate allies or provoke punishment. The jester's influence depended on skill, intelligence, and keen perception of the audience, whether in the castle or in town. When we picture a jester today, the image comes immediately to mind. The brightly colored motley outfit, the cap with its floppy ears or horns tipped with bells, and that curious puppet scepter, often called a bauble. It is remarkable how uniform this visual image has become, despite the fact that jesters lived and worked across centuries and in many different courts. Why, we might ask, did this particular costume and set of props become so enduring? What purpose did they serve beyond simple comedy? To answer these questions, we must look at the jester's role not just as an entertainer, but as a symbolic figure within the highly hierarchical world of medieval society. The costume itself was no accident. The motley, with its multicolored, often patchwork design, symbolized disorder. In a world where nobles dressed in silks, velvets, and coats of arms displaying lineage and order, the jester was quite literally wearing chaos on his body. His clothing broke all rules of heraldry and courtly fashion. Where others wore a coherent identity, the fool wore fragmentation. This deliberate wrongness visually signaled that he existed outside the norms, free from the strict codes that governed everyone else in the court. Now let us consider the cap, the most distinctive piece of the jester's attire. Often it resembled donkey ears or the comb of a rooster. Both symbols had meaning. The donkey had long been an emblem of foolishness, stubbornness, and mockery. To put donkey ears on a man's head was to proclaim him a fool openly. Yet, paradoxically, it was a fool who wore them by choice, not out of ignorance. Similarly, the rooster's comb was a playful parody of nobility. A rooster struts proudly in the farmyard, as though it were a lord of hen. By wearing this parody crown, the jester lampooned the vanity of rulers who wore real crowns. Attached to this cap were small bells. The bells served a practical purpose. They ensured that everyone heard the jester coming, but more deeply, they reinforced his identity as one who could not blend in. In the silence of a solemn court, the fool jingled with every step, a constant reminder of his role as disruptor. We might think of the bells as an audible declaration of, I am different. I am apart. It is important to note that the bells also echoed religious symbolism. In churches, bells were used to call attention, to signify transitions, or to mark the holy. The jester, inverting this, used his bells to mark the unholy, the ridiculous, the absurd. Perhaps the most intriguing of the jester's props was the bauble, a small scepter, often topped with a carved head, sometimes grotesque, sometimes a miniature of the jester's own face. At first glance, this may seem like a child's toy, but its symbolism runs deep. It was, in essence, a parody of the king's scepter. The king held a staff of power, authority, and law. The fool, meanwhile, held a staff of mockery, irony, and inversion. Sometimes the bauble even had a little bladder or inflated pouch attached, which the fool could use to strike people playfully without causing real harm. Again, and this was symbolic. The jester's blows were never fatal, only mocking, in contrast to the king's sword. In this sense, the costume and props acted almost like a uniform of license. They gave the jester permission to break rules. A man dressed in motley was not mistaken for a courtier or knight. He was instantly identified as a fool, and thus he was granted the strange privilege of saying what others could not. His very clothing became his shield. When he criticized the king, it was the motley speaking, not a treasonous subject. When he parodied a noble, the bells and bauble mark it as jest, not rebellion. The symbolism of the jester's outfit also connected to broader cultural traditions, particularly the Festival of Carnival and the Feast of Fools. During these events, ordinary people dressed in outrageous costumes, turning the world upside down in a brief suspension of social order. The jester's costume carried that carnival spirit into the everyday life of the court. He was a living festival, a permanent reminder that order could always be subverted. Interestingly, not all jesters wore the classic motley. Some natural fools, those with mental or physical differences, might dress in simple clothing. But even here, props and gestures often mark them as set apart. Records describe some fools dressed in animal skins or with caps adorned in strange shapes. The idea remained the same. It is also worth noting the psychological effect of the costume. By dressing the fool so absurdly, the court reinforced his marginality. Yet, paradoxically, this marginality gave him centrality. Everyone noticed the jester. He could not fade into the background as a servant or soldier might. His ridiculousness made him memorable. When he delivered a biting truth wrapped in a joke, no one forgot who had said it. In this way, the costume amplified his voice rather than silenced it. The image of the fool in motley cap and bells became so iconic that it transcended the medieval court. It appeared in manuscripts, carvings, and paint. Over time, the jester's appearance solidified into a stock character of theater, especially in commedia dell'arte and later in Shakespearean drama. Even today, when we see a court jester costume at a festival or a cartoon, we know immediately what it means. Someone who will mock, invert, and speak truths through laughter. To limit the jester's world to the royal hall would be to miss an essential part of his legacy. The jester was not only a figure of entertainment, but also a bridge between oral storytelling traditions, the emerging forms of theater, and even the great literature of the medieval and early modern worlds. His role in shaping the way stories were told is one of the most fascinating, and perhaps least appreciated, aspects of his profession. Long before written literature became widespread, Europe lived by stories told aloud. Folk tales, legends, and moral anecdotes traveled from village to village, passed from one tongue to another. The jester, like the minstrel, was a custodian of this oral heritage. He entertained, yes, but he also transmitted narratives. In this sense, he was as much a memory keeper as a commentator. Unlike minstrels who might favor epic songs of knights and saints, the jester specialized in shorter, sharper forms. He told humorous tales, fables with ironic twists, and anecdotes in which kings, priests, or even peasants were turned upside down. His stories were often rival, sometimes crude, but always accessible. The audience, whether noble or common, recognized themselves in the laughter. What distinguished the jester's storytelling was the performance. He was not a reciter, he was a dramatizer. He used mimicry, funny voices, and physical gestures to embody his characters. When a jester told a tale about a greedy merchant, he puffed up his cheeks, widened his eyes, and strutted like a man counting coins. When he mocked a pompous knight, he might stumble about clumsily in imitation of armor too heavy for his wit. This physicalized storytelling paved the way for theatrical performance proper. The line between jesters and early actors is thin. In many medieval courts, jesters were brought in during performances of morality plays or masks. Sometimes they appeared on stage to disrupt the solemn action with a comic interlude. For example, in a play about the virtues and vices, a fool might stumble in, mocking both heaven and hell before being ushered away. His role was not simply distraction, it reminded the audience that laughter had its place even in moral contemplation. The fool became a stock figure in medieval drama, particularly in folk plays and farces. The French tradition of farce, thriving in the 14th and 15th centuries, often used fools to highlight hypocrisy in townspeople, priests, or officials. These plays were not just for kings, but for crowds in marketplaces. In England, too, mystery plays occasionally used comic characters reminiscent of jesters to lighten biblical story. Imagine Noah's wife scolding him in a comic tirade, and you glimpse how jester-like humor seeped into even sacred theater. It is in commedia dell'arte, however, that we see the clearest inheritance. Though commedia developed in Renaissance Italy rather than medieval Europe, its zany characters, the clowns, tricksters, and fools, owe much to the jester's tradition. Arlecchino, with his patchwork costume, acrobatics, and clever stupidity, is essentially a theatrical descendant of the medieval fool. When we turn to literature, the jester's voice rings loudly, even when not explicitly named. Geoffrey Chaucer, writing in the late 14th century, filled his Canterbury Tales with characters who speak in the fool's mode, bawdy, satirical, and subversive. The Miller, with his ribald story mocking clerics, or the Wife of Bath, with her humorous worldly wisdom, both channel the jester's spirit. They speak truth cloaked in laughter. But it is in William Shakespeare's plays, written at the turn of the 17th century, that the literary fool reaches his pinnacle. Think of Festa in Twelfth Night, Touchstone in As You Like It, or the unnamed fool in King Lear. These characters entertain, but they also speak wisdom that others cannot. The fool in King Lear is perhaps the most famous example. While Lear's courtiers flatter or remain silent, the fool tells Lear bluntly that he is foolish to divide his kingdom. Wrapped in riddles and songs, the fool delivers truths no one else dares to speak. His costume and license protect him, but his words pierce deeper than any counselor's. This is the essence of the jester in literature, a voice of honesty disguised as folly. Even outside Shakespeare, the jester appears in countless romances and stories. In French tales, fools often serve as companions to knights, providing comic relief but also unexpected advice. In German literature, Till Eulenspiegel, the trickster figure, embodies the jester's mischief on the page. He cheats priests, mocks merchants, and exposes human folly in episodic tales that delighted readers across Europe. By appearing in both oral and written narratives, the jester became more than a performer. He became a cultural commentator. His stories did not simply amuse. They offered reflections on society's contradictions. The tale of a fool who outwits a noble may have been funny, but it also hinted at the instability of rigid hierarchies. A comic turned a play may have drawn laughter, but it also released social tensions. This is why the jester, unlike the simple clown, became so enduring. He was not only an entertainer, but also a lens. Through his words and actions, audiences saw themselves refracted, sometimes flatteringly, often critically. In literature, this role continues. The fool remains one of the richest archetypes precisely because he allows authors to say what might otherwise be unspeakable. The jester's storytelling influence echoes into modern times. Stand-up comedians, satirists, and even cartoonists carry his torch. When a modern comic impersonates a politician on stage, they are doing what jesters once did in courts, using mimicry to reveal truths through laughter. When a satirical television show parodies the powerful, it continues the tradition of the fool's commentary. Theatrically, clowns in circuses, vaudeville comedians, and even some film characters all descend from the jester's lineage. Charlie Chaplin's tramp, for instance, is a kind of modern fool, visually absurd, physically comic, yet speaking volumes about society through his silence. And in literature, The jester archetype remains vital. Novelists and playwrights still use fool-like characters, outsiders, who, by appearing ridiculous, gain the freedom to reveal hidden truths. We now arrive at the final part of our exploration of medieval jesters. We have traced their origins, their daily life at court and in society, their skills and paradoxical status, and their eventual decline. But our story does not end in the Middle Ages. The jester survived in literature, in art, in memory, and in ways that still shape our culture today. In this concluding lecture, we will look at how fools were represented in the arts, how they evolved in later traditions, and why they remain such powerful symbols. Let us begin with literature, because here the fool found a second life. Medieval drama often included fools, both in the serious morality plays and the lighter mystery plays. These fools were sometimes comic relief, but often they carried moral weight, embodying the vices of vanity or gluttony, or reminding audiences of the fragility of wisdom. With the coming of the Renaissance, literature gave the fool a more complex voice. The best-known example, of course, is Shakespeare. His plays are filled with fools and clowns, but they are not merely silly characters. Take Festa in Twelfth Night, a wandering clown who sings haunting songs and offers sharp insights. He calls himself a fool, yet he is among the wisest in the play. Or take the fool in King Lear. He mocks Lear relentlessly, yet he is also the only character who speaks the truth to him. Even as the kingdom collapses into tragedy. Shakespeare elevated the jester to a literary archetype. The truth-teller cloaked in folly. Beyond Shakespeare, we find fools in the works of Cervantes, Rabelais, and other Renaissance writers. These authors used comic characters to satirize authority, to question social norms, to expose human folly. The fool became a vehicle for critique. The visual arts also kept the jester alive. In medieval manuscripts, we see fools depicted in margins. Grotesque, playful, sometimes in Renaissance paintings, the jester often appears at the edges of royal portraits, a reminder of the monarch's humanity. Later, in Romantic art, the jester became a tragic figure. Painters like Antoine Verts, or later illustrators, depicted fools as lonely, melancholy, aware of truths no one else would face. The bright motley became a symbol not of comedy, but of existential sadness. This transformation shows how the jester could be reimagined to fit the concerns of each age. Psychologically, a fool endures as an archetype. In Jungian terms, he resembles the trickster, disruptive, chaotic, revealing hidden truths by breaking the rules. In tarot, the Fool card is numbered 0, both beginning and end, innocent and wise, a traveler stepping into the unknown. These symbols echo the medieval fool's paradox. Both outside of order and essential to it, the fool's archetype also resonates in literature far beyond the Renaissance. Consider Dostoevsky's The Idiot, where Prince Mishkin, though innocent and mocked, possesses a deeper moral vision than those around him. Or consider modern fantasy, where the court jester trope recurs as a character who hides wisdom behind jest. Even though royal courts no longer employ fools, their legacy lives on in modern entertainment. The most obvious descendants are clowns and comedians. The circus clown, with his painted face and exaggerated antics, inherits much from the medieval fool's costume and physical humor. Street performers, stand-up comics, satirists, all continue the tradition of using laughter to reveal uncomfortable truths. Political satire, in particular, is a direct heir of the jester's role. When a modern comedian mocks politicians on late-night television, or when a cartoonist caricatures leaders in a newspaper, they are exercising the same privilege once given to fools at court: the freedom to criticize through humor. The difference, of course, is that today this is not the privilege of a single figure protected by the monarch, but of a broad culture of free speech. Yet the spirit is strikingly similar. Fantasy novels and films often include jesters as characters, symbols of trickery or wisdom. In video games and comic books, the jester figure appears again and again. The motley costume and bells remain powerful symbols. As we finish, let me leave you with a final thought. The medieval jester may seem a relic of the past, but in every age, society needs its fools, those who can mock the mighty, who can lighten burdens, who can remind us that life is not only serious, but also absurd. In studying the jester, we are really studying ourselves, our hunger for laughter, our fear of truth, our need for someone who dares to dance at the edge of order. And now, one last discussion question for you. Do you think our modern jesters, comedians, satirists, clowns, still carry the same power to influence society? Thank you very much for tuning in. This was Earl Thomas, historian, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening.